this next book might be for a little bit of a niche market, just a little bit, here on BookTube, which you can probably tell from the subtitle of the book. But it's interesting, and I'll tell you why I read it and what I thought about it. But the book is called The Night Battles, Witchcraft and Agrarian Cults in the 16th and 17th Centuries by Carlo Ginzburg, and translated by John and Ann Tedeschi. This is a really, really interesting book. It's actually Carlo Ginzburg, if you're familiar with history and historiography, he's really one of this book sort of inaugurated the interest in what's often called microhistory, which is the study of the traditions, folklore, life ways of people who weren't bigwigs, who weren't kings and queens, who weren't, diplomats who changed the world, but were just everyday people. And this is really one of the books that helped pave the way for that field. This is a really, really extraordinarily complex set of historical observations and data that even beginning to write about it or to talk about it seems like a pretty daunting task. Making matters short and sweet for the sake of reviewing the book here, reviewing a book of such scholarship might not seem advisable, but that's what I'll try to do. This book carefully examines a lot of things, including folklore, popular tradition, and culture. In the Friuli region of Italy, which is the far northeastern province of Italy, a group known as the Benandanti, or literally the Wellfarers, or the Good Walkers, but it's translated here as the Night Battlers. So they leave their villages on prescribed nights of the year to engage in fights with witches. Okay. These men and women who identify themselves as Benandanti are born with the call. You might have heard from butchery caul fat, which is a sort of a thin layer of sort of like amniotic type fat. They're born with it around their neck, and their parents apparently keep it. And if you're born with the caul around your neck, that is the sign that you're born to be a member of this select few called the Benandanti. And that sort of marks them from birth. According to them, the purpose of these nighttime adventures were to fight witches who were trying to infect and kill crops. They saw themselves as protector of the crops in the Friuli region. Therefore, they're usually identified as a kind of agrarian cult, not surprisingly. The origins of the cult are somewhat ambiguous, but they seem to date back to older German divinity cults, and especially the auspices of the goddess Diana. No matter their origins, this is the most important thing. The Benandanti always imagined themselves as warriors for a Christian God, and completely Christian themselves. They saw that this doing battle with the witches was a Christian activity. Very important to keep in mind for what comes later. The most fascinating part of the book, which by far takes up most of its content and its space, is what happens when this cult sort of culturally bumps into the Catholic Church in the form of the Inquisition. Over a very long period of time, this interaction slowly turns a very Christian cult into a devilish coven of witches convening at a sabbat against God's will, and therefore against the will of the church. And the church basically does this not in a conscious willed way, but it sort of interprets the actions of this cult as being something devilish, as being witch-like. Some claimed that the night battles were these dreamlike, oniric visions, while others insinuated that they were actually quite real. Some of them said that they rode to the middle of the fields to battle the witches on the backs of rats. You get various sort of odd things in here, but it's a lot of these details are unclear. Do they think that this is sort of a mystical vision cult, or is it something that actually happens? Those lines are blurred throughout the book, and it's somewhat difficult to discern. But there were other irregularities that were quickly latched onto by the church, and it would soon be turned into, like I said, at least in the eyes of the church, as nothing short of witchcraft. Because Ginzburg spends most of his time showing this careful transformation from this Christian agrarian cult, who identifies itself openly as Christian, into something that the Catholic Church has major problems with because it sees them as witches. It's a very, very slow, gradual transformation over a period of about 100 or 150 years. And he goes over several dozen, maybe 2 to 3 dozen case studies that are all very carefully examined, sometimes dropped and then picked up later in the text and then re-examined and then redacted and amended. And it's a very scholarly book. This can make the thread of the argument and its most prominent actors kind of difficult to keep straight, at least for a casual reader like me. But despite Ginzburg's tight, short presentation, the book is only about 150 pages long. Parts of the book can seem repetitive. Of course, this aspect of the book is essential for scholars of the Italian folklore of the 16th and 17th centuries, much of the stuff that he talks about. But it can be more than a little tedious for someone like me, who is just interested in one of the more seminal texts in, as I said, what we call the development of microhistory. While this might be difficult for someone with a less than scholarly interest in this material, and my interest is certainly less than scholarly. Like I said, it's kind of casual. It's nonetheless a careful and very important study that deserves all of the attention it's garnered, and it has garnered quite a bit in the past. I think it's been about 45 years since it was published. But just a fascinating look at what happens when two cultural institutions, one very formalized, hierarchical, structured, the Catholic Church, meets this, in somewhat, comparatively at least, unstructured, rustic, agrarian cult. And by cult, I don't mean any derogative, negative sense. It was just a sort of like a folkloric tradition. And when those two things, meet, just the most fascinating things happen. So it definitely makes for some interesting history, and it makes you sort of reconceptualize a lot of the things that you think about as historical events and how history happens. That sometimes the real action is in sort of the interstices of two things meeting, and not the actual events or the things themselves. So I apologize for the nerdiness and sort of niche nature of the review. As I said, The Night Battles, Witchcraft and Agrarian Cults in the 16th and 17th Centuries by Carlo Ginzburg.